I'm Sarah, and if you had told me that falling in love would lead me straight into a battlefield, I might have stayed single. But here we are, or rather, here I was, fresh into medical school, with dreams bigger than my budget. I had been studying at the college for a couple of years, living off ramen and coffee, and picking up night shifts at the local hospital to keep the lights on. Then, at a typical blowout student party, filled with too loud music and cheap beer, I met Tom. Tom was something else, polite, a bit too clean-cut for these parties, and always with a clever comment. He was studying law, and not just anywhere, but at one of those schools where his classmates were more likely to end up on TV than not. "Hey, I haven't seen you around before," I said, making my way through the crowd to where he was standing by the makeshift bar. He looked up, a bit surprised, then shot me a smile. "Just hiding from the chaos, Tom." He extended his hand, which I shook, feeling the firmness of his grip. "Sarah," I replied. "Med student by day, coffee zombie by night." He laughed. "Sounds intense. Law's a snooze fest compared to that." We hit it off instantly. Within weeks, Tom and I were a thing, and I was happy. I mean, really happy. Then came the day he wanted me to meet his folks. I should have seen the storm coming. His parents lived in one of those massive houses where you could play hide and seek and actually need to call for help to find each other. I remember standing at their door, decked out in the nicest dress I owned, which suddenly felt too plain. Tom's mom, Mrs. Waverly, opened the door, and her eyes did a quick scan from my head to my toes. The chill in her hello could have frosted a cake. "Mom, this is Sarah." "Sarah, my mother," Tom introduced us, unaware of the ice in the air. Mrs. Waverly forced a smile. "Pleasure. Come in." Dinner was like sitting in a court where I was both the accused and the only witness. The table was set like something out of a magazine, with more forks and knives than I knew what to do with. "So, Sarah, Tom tells us you're in medical school. That must be interesting," Mr. Waverly said, in a tone that suggested he found it anything but. "It is, sir. Every day's a new challenge," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Waverly joined in, her words sharp and quick. "And you work as well? A nurse, was it?" "Yes, at the city hospital. It's a good experience," I said, feeling my face heat up. She smirked. "Oh, a nurse. Well, we always need someone to clean up, don't we?" Mr. Waverly, meanwhile, had excused himself, mentioning something about needing to check on some work in his study. A convenient escape. The rest of the evening didn't improve. Mrs. Waverly's comments ranged from my family background, "So, your parents do, what exactly?" to my attire, "That dress is interesting. Where did you get it?" Each word was a barb, each glance a judgment. I wanted to defend myself, to tell her that I was more than my job, more than my clothes, more than the sum of my bank account. But I bit my tongue, for Tom's sake. As we drove home, the coldness of that night settled deep in my bones. I turned to Tom, trying to lighten the mood. "How about we just elope?" I half-joked, imagining a small, quiet wedding, just the two of us. Tom didn't laugh. He looked at me, dead serious. "Sarah, I want the big day, gala, guests, the whole 9 yards. We just gotta warm up to my parents a bit more, especially you." His words felt like a bucket of ice water. I nodded, hiding my disappointment. "Okay, we'll try it your way," I said, though my stomach knotted at the thought. Not a week later, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Waverly. "Sarah, darling, could you pop over this afternoon? I need a bit of help around the house." Her voice was sweet, which should have been my first warning. Something about her tone didn't sit right, but I agreed. I baked some cupcakes, chocolate, everyone's favorite, or so I thought, and dressed in my prettiest casual dress, hoping to make a better impression. When I arrived, the house loomed large and unfriendly, just like my memories of it. Mrs. Waverly met me at the door, not with a smile, but with a mop and a bucket. "Oh good, you're here. The housekeeper's sick, and we're in a dreadful state. You don't mind helping out, do you?" I stood there, cupcakes in hand, now holding a mop. No, of course not, I stammered, more out of shock than willingness. Great. Start in the kitchen. And you can just leave those. She nodded disdainfully at my cupcakes. In the trash. I don't eat that. My cheeks burned, but I swallowed the hurt. I wasn't going to let her see me upset. I moved to the kitchen and started scrubbing. The house was massive, and cleaning it felt like an endless task. As I worked, I could hear laughter from the pool area where Mrs. Waverly and her friends lounged. Hours later, hands raw and back aching, I called out, "Mrs. Waverly, I've finished. Is there anything else?" She sauntered in, inspecting my work with a hawk's eye, searching for any speck of dust to criticize. Finally, she had to concede. "Well, it does look spotless. You do know your way around a mop, Sarah. How about twice a week then?" I stared at her, mouth agape. I have my studies, night shifts at the hospital, and my thesis." Mrs. Waverly's face hardened. "Listen, dear, if you want to be part of this family, these are the hoops you jump through. Tom's waiting for us to get along. Don't disappoint him, or me." The threat was clear. Marry Tom, clean the house. Don't, and well, the alternative wasn't an option. "Okay," I muttered, defeated. Twice a week, I came, I cleaned, and each time, Mrs. Waverly found new ways to remind me of where I came from and where she thought I belonged. Twice a week, like clockwork, I scrubbed and cleaned Tom's family mansion. It wasn't what I signed up for when I imagined a life with him, but Mrs. Waverly seemed to have decided my role long before I even had a say. "You look just right with a mop, Sarah. It suits you better than a stethoscope ever will," she would taunt as she watched me from her perch, sipping her expensive tea. Nobody knew about this arrangement, not Tom, not his dad. Just me and Mrs. Waverly in this twisted secret of servitude. She never paid me. Instead, she paid with sharp jabs about my background, about how I was practically a charity case they had taken in. The year wore on, and between the cleaning, my intern shifts at the hospital, and my studies, my graduation project nearly suffered. But I powered through, fueled by the dream of the day I could finally call myself a doctor. Amid all this, wedding plans buzzed in the background. Mrs. Waverly took the reins, dictating everything from the napkin folds to the guest list. "We need to teach you how to not embarrass us," she declared one afternoon, enrolling me in an etiquette school. "You can't go around looking like a hillbilly at your own wedding." The etiquette classes were a whole new level of humiliation. The instructor, a stern woman named Mrs. Penrose, had no patience for my lack of sophistication. No. It's left hand on the lap, right hand for the fork. Have you never dined anywhere that didn't have plastic cutlery?" she chided during one of our sessions. "I'm trying my best," I muttered, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks as I fumbled with the silverware again. Mrs. Penrose sighed, a sound of weary frustration. "Your best needs to get a lot better. This is basic, my dear." As if the etiquette lessons weren't enough, Mrs. Waverly's next project was dance lessons, and then, French lessons. "You'll sing a lovely French song at the wedding," she announced with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I can't even sing in English, Mrs. Waverly. And I really don't have time to learn French," I protested, but my words fell on deaf ears. When I brought up these absurd demands to Tom, hoping for some support, he only tightened his lips and repeated the family mantra. "My mom's just looking out for us. You know how important this is. Just stick with it, okay?" I felt a mixture of anger and helplessness. It wasn't just the cleaning or the classes, it was his inability to see how much I was struggling just to fit into this image his mother had crafted for me. I remember walking into the dance studio, my body aching from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, and meeting my dance instructor, a lively man named Marco who seemed to dance rather than walk. "Light on your feet, eh? Let's see what you've got," Marco chuckled, putting on some classical music. I tried to follow along, but my movements were clumsy, my mind too full of medical terminologies and French vocab I had crammed the night before. Whoa, it's dancing, not wrestling," Marco laughed, stopping the music. Relax, you're too stiff. Imagine you're floating. Floating's hard when you feel like sinking, I admitted, half laughing at my own sad joke. As I lay in bed that night, the weight of the world seemed to press down on me. Etiquette, dancing, French, cleaning, each demand piling on top of the last until I felt I could barely breathe. The wedding was fast approaching, and the tension was as thick as the fancy curtains in Tom's family living room. Mrs. Waverly, always plotting, decided a bachelorette party was in order, a final hurrah before the big day, she said. I arrived at their house, dressed casually but elegantly, hoping to at least enjoy an evening without tasks or lessons. Mrs. Waverly greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah, darling, so glad you could make it. Here, you must try some of this champagne, it's from Tom's father's collection. I hesitated. Oh, I don't really drink, I murmured, trying not to make a scene. Nonsense. She laughed, handing me a flute filled with bubbly liquid. It's a celebration. Just one glass won't hurt. The room was filled with her friends, all elegantly dressed, their eyes sharp and calculating like birds of prey. Feeling the pressure, I took a small sip to appease her, intending to set the glass down and forget it. But the room started spinning soon after, and everything became a blur. I woke up suddenly to the harsh sensation of cold water splashing on my face. Mrs. Waverly stood over me, her expression twisted with fake concern that quickly shifted to scorn. Look at you. Drunk and passed out. How disgraceful. I blinked, trying to orient myself. The room was still spinning, and I could hear murmurs and snickers around me. My eyes found Tom and his father, both staring down at a phone. Mr. Waverly's voice boomed. This is outrageous. I knew she wasn't right for our family. What's going on? I managed to stammer, my voice hoarse, my mind racing to piece together the situation. Mr. Waverly, face red with anger, thrust the phone at me. The screen showed pictures of me, but not just any pictures. In them, I was sprawled on the couch, my clothing disheveled to reveal my underwear, a bottle of alcohol carelessly placed in my limp hand, and a cigarette dangling from my lips. My eyes were closed, head lolling in a way that screamed of a setup. I felt my heart sink. I didn't do this, I whispered, looking up at them, my plea clear in my eyes. Tom looked from the phone to me, his expression torn. Mrs. Waverly cut in, her voice sharp. Oh please, look at yourself. Do you expect us to believe you're innocent? This is who you really are, Sarah. No, you've got to listen to me, I started, my voice gaining strength as I found my footing, despite the dizziness. I didn't drink that much. Just one glass, and I didn't even want it. Something was in that drink, you did this. Mrs. Waverly feigned shock, her hand at her chest. How dare you accuse me of such a thing? After all we've done for you, this is how you repay our kindness? The room was thick with tension, the air almost suffocating as accusations flew. Standing there, soaked and humiliated, I knew I had to take control of the situation. I'm going to the hospital, I declared, my voice steady, despite the chaos. I'll donate blood for tests. If they find anything, any drug that shouldn't be there, I'm reporting this to the police. Mrs. Waverly's face drained of color, her usual composure slipping as the gravity of my words hit her. She glanced around, her eyes darting between the shocked faces of her guests and her family. It was just a sleeping pill, she blurted out, the words spilling from her lips in a panicked rush. I just wanted to lighten up the party. I didn't mean any harm. Tom's face was a mix of anger and disbelief. Mom, how could you? He turned to me, his eyes softening. Sarah, I'm so sorry. Please, let's not involve the police. Think about the family's reputation. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the desperation in his eyes. It was always about the family's reputation, wasn't it? Never about what was right. I won't go to the police, I said slowly, but on one condition. What is it? Tom asked, relief flickering in his eyes. I'm not your family's cleaner. Not anymore. And I'm certainly not working for free. The silence that followed was heavy. Tom and Mr. Waverley exchanged looks of shock, clearly unaware of what I had been put through. Mrs. Waverley attempted to smile, her usual charm seeping through her facade. Let's not dwell on past misunderstandings. We were all preparing for the wedding, after all. I cut her off, my patience wearing thin. It's not a misunderstanding. For the past year, your wife has had me cleaning your house under the pretense that it was just helping out. I was never paid, and all the while, she pocketed the money meant for the cleaner. Mr. Waverley turned to his wife, his voice low and dangerous. Is this true, Helen? She hesitated, then nodded, her eyes avoiding mine. I thought it would be a good test of her character, she muttered. Test of her character? I echoed, incredulous. Is that what you call exploitation? Mr. Waverley's face was a mask of anger and embarrassment. He looked from his wife to me, the pieces falling into place. Sarah, I owe you an apology. I had no idea. Tom took my hand, his touch gentle. The wedding is still on if you want it. I'm sorry for all of this. Really sorry. I nodded, accepting his apology, but feeling the weight of his mother's gaze on me. As the room began to clear, Mrs. Waverley leaned in, her whisper harsh against my ear. I'll find a way to separate you two. This isn't over. On the day of my wedding, draped in a gown that made me feel like a princess out of a fairy tale, I was floating on air. Yet, every so often, Mrs. Waverley's thinly veiled threats echoed in my mind, casting long shadows over my joy. As we stood at the altar, Mrs. Waverley approached, her steps measured, her smile too sweet. Sarah, dear, it's time for your surprise. Remember? You promised to delight us with a little French song. Her voice was light, but her eyes glittered with mischief. I froze, the words hitting me like ice water. I'm not ready to sing, especially not in French, I whispered, turning towards Tom with a desperate look. Tom, caught in the middle of his mother's schemes and his own desire to keep the peace, seemed conflicted. He gave me a tight smile. Come on, Sarah, it's just a song. Let's not upset anyone. Do it for the family, for the guests. Reluctantly, I walked over to the DJ booth, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the murmur of the crowd. The DJ, a young guy with sympathetic eyes, leaned in as I approached. Your mother-in-law insisted on non-Jene regret rain. Tough song, even for the pros. My stomach nodded. She had set me up to fail, to humiliate me in front of everyone we cared about. But I wasn't going to let her have this victory. Not today. I had something else in mind, something she wouldn't see coming. As I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, Mrs. Waverley clapped her hands, drawing the attention of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, please, let's give Sarah our full attention. She's been practicing so hard. Her voice was saccharine sweet, laced with venom. Remember, no laughing too loudly. The crowd turned to me, expectant faces all around. I could feel their curiosity, their anticipation. Some were puzzled, wondering since when had I developed a talent for singing, let alone in French. As the music started, I held the microphone with a shaky hand, knowing that I wasn't about to sing. Instead, I had orchestrated a reveal that would expose the true colors of the woman who had tried to undermine me at every turn. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the screen. I have something important to show you all, I announced, my voice echoing through the hall. The room hushed, the playful notes of the French song dying away as the projector flickered to life. Instead of the romantic vistas of France, the screen displayed a series of images and videos that captured Mrs. Waverley in intimate moments with the young pool cleaner. The gasps and murmurs swelled into a loud buzz as each new image made her deception clearer. Mrs. Waverley's face turned a deep shade of red, then white as she realized the extent of her exposure. She spun towards me, fury contorting her features. You wretch! How dare you invade my privacy like this? She shrieked, her composure breaking like thin ice underfoot. Tom was staring at the screen, his expression one of disbelief. When he finally spoke, his words were like daggers. You've destroyed my family's reputation with your spite. You're just an ungrateful beggar. You should have appreciated what we were offering you." My heart felt heavy, but my resolve did not waver. "Tom," I replied, my voice clear and unwavering, "you can't destroy what never existed. Your family's reputation was a lie." With that, I took off my wedding veil, placed the microphone back on its stand, and picked up my bouquet from the table. I walked up to Tom, and with everyone watching, I threw the bouquet at his feet. I could never marry a man who refuses to stand by me, who can't see the truth for what it is. The room was in chaos, whispers turning into shouts as the implications of the scandal began to sink in. Mr. Waverley turned to his wife, his voice laced with disgust. "How could you do this to us? To our family?" Meanwhile, Mrs. Waverley, now completely unhinged, tried to salvage her dignity, but it was too late. The damage was done. "This is not the end, Sarah. I won't let it end like this," she hissed, her eyes darting around the room, looking for any ally in her downfall. But there were none. The guests were a mix of shocked and appalled, their faces reflecting a range of emotions from pity to disdain. The image of a united, respectable family had shattered, replaced by the reality of deceit and betrayal. As I walked out of the church, the weight of the dress felt lighter with each step, the cool air kissing my face with promises of new beginnings. Behind me, the sounds of a family unraveling filled the air, a poignant reminder of the bullet I had dodged. The aftermath was indeed tremendous. Mr. Waverley filed for divorce, and Mrs. Waverley found herself ostracized from the community she had once reigned over. Their family's business suffered as partners pulled out, unwilling to associate with scandal. Tom was left to deal with the fallout, his once unshakable belief in his family's integrity shattered. Years had passed since that fateful day at the altar, and I had since become a practicing surgeon, my days filled with long shifts and life-saving decisions. I had built a new life, one that was mine alone, shaped by my choices, not by deceit or manipulation. It was a typical day at the hospital when she came in, a patient, frail and barely recognizable, cloaked in tattered clothes, a stark contrast to the affluent attire I had once known her in. It took me a moment, but then the recognition hit. It was Mrs. Waverley, the mother of my ex-fiancé. She was wheeled into the emergency room, her face etched with lines of hardship and time, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pain and desperation. As the attending surgeon, it was my job to assess her condition. She needed surgery, urgently, but a quick check revealed she had no insurance, a fact that added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. "Dr. Sarah Thompson," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper as she recognized me. It was the first time she had addressed me without a sneer, and the irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. I need help. Tom, he's turned me away. I have nowhere else to go." "Mrs. Waverley," I started, keeping my voice professional, devoid of the emotions churning inside me. "You need surgery. But without insurance, it's complicated." She clasped her hands together, the once flashy rings she wore now absent, her fingers trembling. "Please, could you pay for it? Or at least do it for free? I'm begging you." Her plea was pathetic, a far cry from the commanding tone she once wielded like a weapon. I took a deep breath, the weight of her request heavy on my shoulders. This was more than just a medical decision, it was a moral crossroads. "Mrs. Waverley," I said slowly, each word deliberate. "I'm a surgeon, not a charity. You treated me horribly, manipulated your son against me, tried to ruin my life. You're not my responsibility. But I have nothing left," she countered weakly, the fight seemingly gone from her voice. "And whose fault is that?" I replied, my tone colder than I intended. "You made your choices, Mrs. Waverley. You chose to deceive, to scorn, to alienate. Now, you live with those choices." She looked at me, her eyes widening slightly as if seeing me for the first time. Not the young woman she could bully, but the doctor I had become, hardened by years of saving lives and surviving the cuts of both scalpel and scorn. "I will ensure you get the minimal care required by law," I continued, turning away to hide the conflict inside me. But I won't pay for your surgery. I won't bend the rules for you. You need to make arrangements, or the state will. Leaving her in the care of the nursing staff, I walked out of the room, her soft sobs fading behind me. It was a harsh stance, perhaps, but life had taught me that mercy was a luxury sometimes, especially for those who had never shown any themselves.